All right, welcome everybody. This is the September Agile Austin Coaching Meetup. Lonnie, if you want to go to the next slide. I'm Sid Markle, and joining me is Lonnie Dame. We host the coaching meetup once a month for Agile Austin, although we tend to do it virtually. So we have attendance from around the world, not just Austin. And we're so glad because one of the things we really want to do is build the Agile community, especially through monthly conversations on the topics that help us build our Agile coaching competencies. So as I mentioned, we do that every first Monday of the month. We are on the second Monday of this month because of the Labor Day holiday, and want to acknowledge that it is September 11th, and we all have different memories of that day. And I just want to acknowledge that we're gathering on that day out of respect to the lives that were lost. Here's what you can expect from tonight. Lonnie and I will facilitate the questions and conversation. We worked with Bryan up front to figure out the format and how he'd like to handle questions. So when he's presenting, we're going to ask that you post your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure those get raised up, especially if they help clarify whatever material is being covered. We encourage you to engage with us and with Bryan in the way that best suits you, whether that's through chat or coming up and speaking, and whether you are on video or not. We've already had some people in chat say making dinner and multitasking, that's okay. So we welcome that. And if you need anything else, or if there are any other conditions that you need for this to be optimal, just let us know and we'll try to accommodate that. I did want to mention that if you're considering expanding your network and you're interested in becoming a co-host with us, we're looking for volunteers that we would like to help bring in and work with us. We have a schedule of speakers all the way through next year, so it would be a nice transition. But we invite anybody who might be interested in joining us to let us know. Okay. All right, move to the next slide. We are a part of a larger community in Agile Austin, and there are several different kinds of meetups through our organization. You can find them all at meetup/Agile Austin. This is the coaching one. There's one for Agile at Scale. There's a book club run by Ned, who mentioned he sent one of the attendants here tonight. That's a great one. The leaders, Lean Kanban, Scrum Masters, and there's a monthly speaker series. So if any of these seem interesting to you, most of them are still being held virtually, a handful in person. So check that out. We are part of Agile Austin, which is a 501c nonprofit, and the goal of our organization is to connect people and foster professional growth through collaborative events like this one. So go to the next slide. We have a big event coming up actually in March. We have an annual conference. It's Keep Austin Agile. So that will be in March. So if anybody's interested, you should check that out. I believe
it's going to be a mix of, they still want to keep it hybrid. So it'll be obviously a lot in person now that we're coming back. At the same time, I know there's intentions to have some of it be hybrid. So some of the sessions, streaming those as well, but more details to come.
More details to come. I believe Bob Galen is our keynote. So that's the detail I was trying to remember there for a moment.
Oh, yes. Yeah. We love Bob. We've had him twice.
We love Bob. All right. We also thank our sponsors because they're the ones who help make events like that possible. And so thank you to our sponsors. Next slide. Coming up next month, we have a fantastic topic, Trust Matters, Transforming Organizations and Lives, with Chichi Afia and Dr. Francesca Ramoni. So if you're interested, that'll be the first Monday of October. And then in November, we're going to have Will Vanderwalt, who's going to be exploring leading with integrity. And then December, we're going to not have a meetup. We're going to try to do something in person. if COVID allows. I know the numbers are on the rise again, but we're hoping we can get together and do do a holiday party, a happy hour or something. So if you're in the area, we hope you'll join us. All right, with that, I'm going to hand over to Lonnie to introduce tonight's speaker.
Perfect. Thank you, Sid. Yeah, so we're really excited to have Bryan with us, Bryan Stallings, who's currently Chief Evangelist at Lucid Software. Though if you look back at just kind of what he's done and then also his credentials, which I love the variety of Agile, also the organization and relationship systems coaching, coactive coaching. So someone who brings a lot of that Agile plus that coaching expertise. And we got introduced to Bryan through some of the articles that he's written around neurodiversity and conflict. And so we actually asked him to kind of put those two topics together because we hear a lot from our coaching community. Conflict is one of those things that you're always trying to figure out, how do you manage that in your teams? And then neurodiversity is this continual topic that perhaps doesn't get as much attention, as it should. So we wanted to have Bryan, come and share his knowledge and expertise with us. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bryan.
Awesome. Thank you, Lanny. And Sid, it's nice to be here. It's nice to be invited. And it's a different experience to be invited than when you're competitively trying to get a speaking slot, right, at a conference. So it was nice to know that you guys had read the things that are out there and that all of you that are here are interested in the topic tonight. So just to let you know what I'm going to try to accomplish tonight is I'm going to try to create a really interactive experience for you. So I know some of you are busy doing other things, but there will be opportunities coming up for small conversations with smaller groups. And there's an interactive board for you to contribute some content on. And right now I'm going to start us with a visual activity that you'll just click on a link and be able to join and participate in that. So there's a variety of things that we can do, I think, to get everybody's perspective in some unique ways. So let me post this in the chat, and then I'll show you what it is and how to participate here on the screen. So you should have a link, a little URL that you can click on. When you click on it, you're going to click on the start button, and it's going to bring you to a quick myth and facts exercise. You're probably familiar with these. So you just grab the cards and drag them to whether it's a myth or a fact. And then I'm going to show on the screen the data as it comes in. And these are a few different things about the topic we're going to discuss tonight to kind of get the ball rolling. When you're done sorting your cards, click the submit button here at the bottom, okay? So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to watch and give you guys a couple of minutes for the results to come in. And if you have any difficulty with it, let me know in the chat. All right, we got people coming in. And now you might find these funny little names because these are all you're all guest users of the system. And so we have Grizzlord and Slopwop, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people already coming in. So we can sort of see where people placed the different cards, whether they are a myth or a fact. Go ahead and keep going. See Panda. And I'm going to check our agreement threshold and sort of see if we have, do we have any that are 5 out of 5? We do. Neurodivergent individuals all have similar experiences and abilities. Somebody went back and edited their cards. Way to go. I saw those move. Neurodiversity is a medical term, and neurodiversity is an increasingly common disorder. Okay, and then over here on the fact side, we see people say, I think this is a fact, neurodiverse individuals face many challenges. 1 in 7 people has a neurodivergent condition. Neurodivergent individuals possess strengths, skills, and talents, and it's about the way our brains are wired. And it's an interesting one. See this card over here about neurodiversity is an increasingly common disorder. It is increasingly common, but we wouldn't call it a disorder. So maybe you think I tricked you with that one, which case I was trying to make it a little bit challenging. All right. So thank you for sharing in that activity. And oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing the screen. Let me bring it back up.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Kim. Hi, Bryan. Saying it's an increasingly common disorder, well, whatever word you want to use, I'm curious as to the science. Is it just more that people are becoming increasingly aware of it, so therefore aware they have it, versus that it's something that is increasing in the population biologically?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
As I look at the data myself, I was looking at it again as we're getting ready for this session, and I saw a graph that showed the increase since the 50s. And so it's a great question that that I don't know the answer of. Is it because we know more? I see a lot of adults being diagnosed, which was something that we didn't understand. For example, with autism, the first individual diagnosed autistic still alive. So it hasn't been around all that long. So I'm certain that there's probably both things happening. There's an increase as well as an increased awareness.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Yeah, I
question.
had a CEO I was coaching. I do executive leadership coaching, and she was just getting diagnosed in her early 40s.
Yeah.
And because her children got diagnosed, and as she learned about it, she's like, oh, I think I am as well, kind of thing.
That's
So
fascinating.
yeah.
I'll share articles with y'all later, but the editor of Quartz magazine who asked me to write about the topic, one thing that the reason she asked is because she had just had a child diagnosed, and while she was at the doctor said, why don't we talk about you as well? And she was also diagnosed. So let's talk a little bit about this. Neurodiversity, for me, this was a new term that I needed to learn about. And so think about it as a compound of neurology and diversity. And it refers to human neurological diversity, or meaning that there's variety in the way our human brains and minds work. And we're all going to be different. Okay. Some maybe more different than, let's say, an average or a norm, whatever that might be, but we're still trying to find the right words to describe this. And so when I was learning about this, one thing that helped me was to think about this word biodiversity. And I thought, okay, I understand biodiversity, it's biological diversity, and it helps me understand that there's a variety of life on Earth. And so when I think about neurodiversity, it helps me to understand there's a variety of the way that we think and process and make sense and such in the world. And it's all about how our brains are wired. So as a group, we are a neurodiverse group, all of us. And I had to learn a little bit about which are the right words to use. So these differences relate to our traits and how we function. Sometimes we may have unique skills and strengths from one another. We'll have different needs and different abilities. And all of that can impact the way that we function in the world. It'll impact our social dynamics, our cognitive functioning, our motor skills. It's going to, cause us to have different types of attention from one another and sensory stimulations in one another. Some may be affected in their speech or the way that they can move, their language, their learning. So lots of diversity in the way that we think and process information. And so there's a lot of specifics here that you might say, okay, well, what does that encompass? So maybe you've heard of some of these, like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. And this is just some of them. I think that experts in the world are still making lists and deciding, and there's some disagreement. But within each of these, there's also different variants and scales of severity. And some in the world have done some writing to give us a few more terms, and they're in an effort to help us classify individuals. And so you might hear the word neurodivergent. And so as you saw in the myth and facts, these are non-medical terms, right? It's this umbrella term that's trying to suggest that any individual who may have a variance from what's typical would be considered somebody who's neurodivergent. So as a group, we may say, okay, this group is neurodiverse, and there may be an individual here who says, yeah, I have ADHD, and so I'm a neurodivergent individual from the group. So that's one word I learned. I also learned that there's a word for people who aren't neurodivergent or who are closer to the mean or the norm in society, and that would be neurotypical. So I hear these words, and you might think about, like, why is this important in the technology industry? Well, there's a greater prevalence, I'll talk about that in a minute, of neurodivergent individuals who pursue STEM fields. So if you work in software like I do, you're going to find that there's a greater propensity for an engineer that you might be working with to be neurodivergent than, say, in a field where there's the arts, for example. And so that means I'm coming into contact with individuals where I need to understand more about them and interact with them than maybe I would otherwise. So I came into contact with this first when I met my wife, Jennifer. So she's my partner of 30 years now. And she was an adult diagnosed with ADHD. So I'm somebody who puts my keys down and can always find them, and Jennifer can't. She has, we just think differently. And I think it drives her crazy sometimes that I think that way, and she thinks a different way. And you're smiling because this is true in your life also sometimes, right? And it drives her crazy that I care about things that she doesn't care or even remember, right? And sometimes it drives me crazy that we have 9 pairs of sunglasses for her and we can't find any of them. So that's kind of where it started. And then Jennifer and I, we have adopted 4 children. This is our family. And each one of them came into our family as a very young child. And so we didn't know a lot about them, but now as they're getting closer to adult age, we've learned a lot, and we have a history that's going to be interesting to share with you. We are a neurodiverse family. And so the specifics here, if I was to share with you, is 2 individuals in this picture have autism, 2 have dyslexia, 4 have ADHD. And there's 2 who have autism and ADHD, and 1 who has autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. So that's a lot of stuff going on, when you think about it. In addition to that, I didn't put up here that there's anxiety and sometimes depression. And, my wife, Jennifer, she's a family therapist and social worker, and she's an expert in a lot of this. I'm really lucky to have her in my life, and our children are as well, because she teaches all of us, helps all of us. And we're working to build a healthy and successful family, and to help these younger ones become successful adults. And part of the reason I'm passionate about this is I don't feel like the world is really ready to help them be successful. If we look at the data, especially around my autistic kids, the 2 youngest, the number of people who are professionals that have autism is very, very low. And it's not because they don't have amazing skills. It's oftentimes because our organizations aren't ready to support them and to help them be successful. So hopefully, like myself, I hope that you think this is a beautiful family. Good reason to learn more about this stuff and to fight for making the world a better place. So I'm glad you're listening to this topic, because I think all of us can make a difference. So it's not just at home that I encounter a neurodiverse community. I find it in my work as well. These are the companies where I've worked, and all of this work has been in technical fields, software and technology, infrastructure, etc. And many of you as well. So I find individuals, like I mentioned, who think differently than one another. Let me share you a little bit about that. So in our population, the data tells us that neurominorities are somewhere between 10 to 15%. So you're going to find them everywhere. And I was talking about the lack of, I think there's fewer opportunities for my children to have, I think, not be underemployed, but to something equivalent to their skills, because the data tells us that so many remain unemployed. A little bit more data is that we find individuals with difficulties, you know, kind of fitting into a team or fitting into society oftentimes, and it may be because they struggle with one of these circumstances. So here's data that tells us that STEM participation in college students is considerably higher when somebody has autism, for example, than not. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So in my case, this is a photograph of an activity I facilitated for a department at Lucid. And in this group, you might not know that there's individuals that are neurodivergent, but there are. It's a neurodiverse group for certain. And like we heard when we were kind of warming things up from Laura, this is our neurodiversity Slack channel. And, you know, I joined it to learn more about the individuals and be able to work with them as a coach and support them. And again, it's really interesting to hear how comfortable and confident they are in sharing their challenges, getting advice from one another, and talking about things like just how do you manage your calendar? You know, how do you deal with some of the chaos of the workplace, and sharing and swapping ideas. So the community's there, it's forming itself, whether or not there's something formal like an ERG, like in Leora's case, or not within your organizations. So how can we make a place for them in our teams? Oh, wait, before I show you the boxing match, I wanted to do one activity with you. Okay. So I think my story is a little bit about, I'm finding these things to be true at home. I'm finding similar challenges at work. And for me, those worlds started to overlap as I tried to educate myself around how do I be a better parent for my kids? How do I be a better colleague, team member, coach with colleagues? And what can I learn in order to make a place that's safe and accommodating and productive? And just like one example, with my son, I remember, I don't know, maybe 50 times telling him that he needs to look at the adults when he talks to them. And then I read an article in my research that as a neurodivergent, as a child, as an autistic child, his brain probably can't process all of that facial and emotional data while he's also trying to listen. And so he needs to look away in order to be a good listener. And I'm asking him to look in the eye to be a good listener, which is exactly the opposite. And I see him masking that need in order to do what he's told. And I realize I'm part of the problem, right? And so I'm trying to educate myself. And part of giving this talk and sharing it with you is part of my effort to learn more about it. So I want to be a supportive parent, and I want to advocate well for my children, and I want to support my colleagues. And in trying to do this research, what I found is that conflict was an area where I had a weakness. I was part of the conflict sometimes, and I also didn't know how to support the conflict well as a coach when it was at home or at work. And I was one of those individuals, like too many, where conflict fires up and we look away, like we don't know what to do. It's like right here, it's hot right in front of us, and we're not sure how to support and deal with it. So, so I want to talk a little bit about conflict today, and that's what Sid and Lonnie asked me to kind of combine. So starting at home, this is Mom and Nate, my 16-year-old, right? I just happened to find this on the internet, but what's funny is it kind of looks like them too. And of course, Mom's skill level is higher than Nate's, so she could probably give him a good wallop. But you know, this conflict it flares up from time to time. And a lot of it may be because there's a different way of thinking and perceiving and sharing information between each individual, where you find conflict, whether it's at home, like in this case, or if it's at work. And so I'm going to share a story about that home situation in just a minute. So here's conflict at work. Take a look at these people's facial expressions. I'm sure this was a posed photograph, but they really captured some of what you see in the workplace, right? You see an individual at the end of the table who's looking away. You see the woman to the right. She's got a slight smile, sort of like, I can't believe this is happening right in front of us. And not to smile. And the person across from her is looking across like, do something. And then you got the two individuals that are pretty upset with each other that we see, right? So as a coach, when you see conflict, or when you see some disregard for an individual's needs that led to conflict, what do you do? How do you approach the conflict? How do you help ensure that it doesn't come back? Oftentimes teams sweep it under the table, or maybe under the rug, hoping that it will just not reoccur. And it does. It just kind of smolders there and then comes back. So I want to gather information from you about conflict and your experience with conflict, and I'm going to do that through a different activity. I'll put that in the chat. And it's the same thing you did before. Just click on the link. And this is like the others, they're all anonymous, but when you click, it'll ask you to share some information about how often you encounter conflict. So the top scale is work-related, the bottom is outside of work. So this is about frequency. So just grab the slider and place it where what's true for you, okay? And then submit. And I'm gonna take us back out and we'll watch the data come in. Okay, we're seeing individuals at work at least once a month, outside of work once every couple of months. It may depend on what you call conflict too, right? There's also healthy conflict that is a part of teams being successful. Sometimes we manage it well and sometimes we don't, but about once a month. Go ahead and keep participating. It was interesting as I gathered data for one of the articles I wrote that it suggests that some people live with conflict almost continuously. And that was shocking to me. Like in the workplace, dealing with conflict almost continuously. I'm lucky to have the choice to say I'd go work somewhere else. And I don't know that everybody does, but that would be really difficult. If I can do anything to help with the conflict that occurs around me or that I'm a part of, I want to know more about how to do that. And so I went to get more help on conflict, and I started working with an individual who I met in Seattle, who was a mediator and a coach. I actually met her while I was going through my coactive coaching, and she said, teach me more about Agile. And I said, teach me more about conflict. And so we worked together in our free time to do some of the things that I'm going to share with you today. So this is really good. If we're having an experience in conflict once a month or about that, then that's 12 opportunities a year at home and at work where we can take action. So let's see if the things that I want to share with you today are useful. So I started to do some experiments. I thought this was a great picture of experiments, right? I tried some experiments, and most of it I was trying at home when my son was 13, because I was a faculty member with the Agile Coaching Institute for a while, and I don't know if I should share this story, but if you lean in a little bit, I'll share this story. So I watched two of my colleagues come close to conflict many times. These are experts in Agile coaching. And every time they would kind of clash a little bit, I would hear them say, we should really create our conflict protocol. And then they would say, yeah, we really should do that. And then they would back away from the conflict and they'd walk away and kind of like cool down. And then a couple of days later, clash, we should really create our conflict protocol. And in our curriculum from the Agile Coaching Institute, we talked about conflict protocols and how to create one. But as I looked at the material, I thought, it doesn't give you enough guidance to really create one. I don't know what this means, and I'm teaching it. So I thought it would be important to do some work in that area. And so I was kind of working on that with the woman who I met in Seattle. I mentioned her name, Samantha Denning. So I want to share with you a little bit about those experiments, because the center of this was my 13-year-old son, now 16, but 13-year-old son. So Nathan is diagnosed with ADHD and autism, and he struggles with impulse control. He's extremely smart when it comes to computers. He loves them, and he will completely reconfigure your iPhone when you don't even expect it. And he gets a ride in a friend's car, and he's changed their parents' audio controls. My brother-in-law called me after we visited him and said, I think somebody put a lock on our heating and air conditioning system. I can't get into the controls, right? He's been suspended from high school more than half a dozen times, oftentimes for crippling their computer systems for something that he has access to, like creating an email, what do you call it when the system crashes because everybody's doing a reply all storm. And it was to something that the school should have locked down, but they didn't. And Nathan just happens to find these things, and he seems to be in the wrong place at all of the wrong times, right? So we were having a conversation about how he was using my iPad and doing some stuff that I hadn't given him permission to, and he got really upset and he rushed out of the room. So one of his coping mechanisms is to go to the garage and spend time with our lovely dog that calms him down, right? And when he came back, I said, I've been working on this tool. I want to try it with you, Nathan, and anything that's in Lucid tools, he's really fascinated with. And he's like, okay, I want to try that too. So he was the very first person who used this thing that I had created with Samantha Denning called the conflict canvas. And his creation looked like this. All right, so our first version was a very simple framework that looked like a silhouette of your head, and it asked you questions. And I'll go through what Nathan put here. He said, the topic is, I was touching and updating technology without asking. He says, well, I wanted to code on the iPad using Python, and then I wanted to share that with Dad. And my fear is that I won't be allowed to code in Python, and Dad is going to take the iPad away. I heard that Dad said, you should ask before updating the OS. This is Dad's iPad. You don't just go through and like change the operating system without asking. And what did I observe? I observed Dad is annoyed and mad. What did you say? I said, I checked the compatibility and it's compatible. And how did you say it? I said it truthfully, but resentfully. And how did you feel in your heart? Also resentful. All right, so this was Nathan's 13-year-old attempt to say, here's how I'm feeling before he comes back to talk to me about this conflict, because the conflict flared up. And I quickly said, could you go cool down before we talk about it? And then when he was cooled down, I said, could you think about what you experienced and share it with me on this document? And I'll do the same. And then we'll bring those together and we'll look at it and talk about our conflict and what we want to do about it. So this has been really useful with teams and parents to talk about conflict and how do we process it. So on the left-hand side, there's prompts to help us think about what we might consider as we go through each of the sections. And the process we go through is we start in the center, and then we start to move down to our heart and then back up to motivations and fears in our head. Okay, I went through it top to bottom, but I think the best way to start is with the senses before we move to our heart and then up to motivations and fears. Okay, so it's a simple two-sided PDF, and it's a fillable PDF, and I'll share it with you. You could use it at home like I did. You can use it with Teams like I do. It's also available as a template. For example, if you were a Lucid user, you could find it here. I just brought it into, if I was working with a team, I could just grab it from the template library and then share it on a board. The two that we're going to talk about tonight are right here. Share it on a board with a team or somebody I'm coaching in order to have that dialogue.
So
Okay.
Bryan, just to play back, so you would start with the, what did you hear and what did you observe and what did you say first? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think my experience has been that oftentimes we're not ready to move into the headspace around fears and motivations until we've started with observations. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
So
And
it kind of spirals. It starts maybe in the center, like, what did you observe, hear, and say? And then it thinks you go down to how did you say it and feel about it? And then back up to, well, what was your motivations in defending or fighting about this? And what fears maybe were involved?
got it. That's cool. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one version I made had this numbered, but it doesn't always follow a sequential path. But yeah, that's what I would coach people, is to start in the center. Okay. So Nathan and I used this, and then I felt better about it. I started to use it with teams. We have a therapist that comes in twice a week to work with our kids. She's an ABA therapist, or she works on their behavior. She's a specialist in that. She wanted to use it with her clients. I used it recently with an organization called the Peace Alliance, and they want to leverage it. So I'm going to share it with you at the end and encourage you to put it to use and make suggestions about how to make it better. So I'm going to share this URL in the chat and let you go and grab it. Let's see. When you get to the URL, it will be a folder on my Google Drive, and there's going to be 2 documents there. And these are PDF versions of what I've shown you. And the conflict canvas is a fillable PDF, so you can just type right into it and save it. And my suggestion is you download them and then you open them from your local drive, because if you try to open them from here, it won't let you edit them since you just have view access. So download them and then you can use them. Again, let me know if you have any troubles. I'm just curious, as you think about conflict in your own life, is there a place where this conflict canvas could be of use this week? Is there an active conflict, even a small one, going on at work, where you might want to have a conversation about, hey, how did that flare up? And you might have it something at home, like Lonnie does.
Okay, sorry. I clicked on your link and it just says, let me see what error it's giving me. It says retry, and I try to, it says you are signed out, sign back in, then click retry.
Is anybody having similar experience, or was anybody able? Okay.
I'm able to get in.
I was able to download.
Yeah, I was able to download as well.
Maybe try again, and Nazi, if it doesn't work, we could email it to you. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm not certain what's going on. I did share it like with everybody in the world. If you have the link, you're supposed to be able to get it. So hopefully everybody's able to get it. And if somebody struggles, we could also share it afterwards. All right. Sid says she also has a 13-year-old. Yeah. Okay, so sometimes just thinking about how you might put something to use is a good start, because there are places where I find that this could go better. in my experience, what happens is we start to see that we're in a conflict, and then we get entrenched, and then we pursue the conflict because we play the game of I've got to be right. If any of you have learned about nonviolent communication, it's all about that game instead of giving and supporting and loving one another, which is what we really are built to do. Instead, a part of our brain takes over and says, I've got to be right. And so sometimes the best thing to do in conflict between two individuals would be to step away and have a chance to really come back to it with more capacity for solving the challenge, with more resourcefulness, and that lets part of our brain that's all about fighting quiet down and lets that prefrontal cortex take over and be more rational. And I found that oftentimes we're fighting face to face like this, and if we can put our conflict canvases out in front of us and we can turn side to side, you do this in coaching as well, I'm sure. It's like, that's the problem out there. We are not the problem. We are going to solve that problem together. And shoulder to shoulder, that is a good orientation alignment of our bodies as we think about, this is a problem to be solved. This is not a person to hate or to fight with, right? So a little bit of preparation can help with that. But we have to be good enough to say, I need to calm down and think and process this a little bit. I'm going to journal on this worksheet before I come back. And then I think we could resolve this if we're able to. All right, I know you guys are doing great in the chat. I struggle to look at you and look at the chat, which is down there at the same time. So I'm trusting Lonnie and Sid to highlight anything that we need to.
I would just like to pipe in. I'm a conflict resolution consultant as well. So from a neuroscience perspective, it's great to take that time to hopefully get you from that hindbrain, that fight or flight, back into the cognitive frontal brain. But you need to have a time to come back. The longer you wait, and 24 hours is too long, it goes into long-term memory, and it's a lot harder to do a conflict resolution at that point because it's in your long-term memory. So yes, take a break, but it's not like we'll come back in 2 days or in a week or something like that. It's a lot harder to get to resolution that way from a neuroscience perspective.
Thank you, Kim.
Wow.
I find that to be true. I'm feeling hurt by 24 hours, and that's a different thing than just angry, right? Okay.
Regarding the chat, Bryan, mostly it's just dialogue kind of going back and forth, emphasizing or commenting on what you've said already. The main question right now is for the folks who are having trouble downloading. We're going to find a way to send it after the fact through Meetup, through an email.
Sounds great. Or if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you could ask me directly too. I appreciate anything that would get these tools in your hand. Okay, I want to talk about the second tool. Nathan and I decided that we wanted to try this conflict protocol thing that I was teaching about. And I felt like in the workplace, we needed a better approach to conflict protocol than just the vague thing that we were teaching at the time. And so everything looks like a canvas. And so I started to work with my friend, Samantha Denning, to build a canvas for this. And this is the one that Nathan and I created following our conflict. So it's a business canvas, but we kind of played with it and we wrote a purpose, right? That's the first thing that you write. There's 4 P's here, and I'll talk to you about those. Mm-hmm. What's our purpose in avoiding conflict, right? We want to have a healthy relationship. And so we want all of these good things where mm-hmm. we can have love, peace, and trust, right? The second thing we worked on was what are our perspectives? What are the lenses that we look through conflict about? And how do we perceive it? And what perspectives could be of service? This might be kind of big, but we know that we're not good at conflict and we want to be better. That was one perspective. Conflict is not great. It feels awful to be angry with a loved one. And we feel like our anger causes us to explode if we hold it in and we don't deal with it. That's especially Nathan's. And then if we work through it, we know that we'll learn about the other person. And if we talk about it, we'll learn about the other person's perspective. And I talked to him about perspective taking and how my perspective is, and his perspective, both are important and both are valid, right? So those were some perspectives that we hold. Then we talked about principles. So these were our fundamental beliefs that are rooted on our values. All right, so what will serve us when things get hard? What inspires us? So we wrote these cards as well. So these are kind of things we value when it comes to time to discuss conflict. For example, everybody gets to be heard, and it's okay that the other person feels their feelings. And we communicate best when we're not hungry, it's not late, and we're not triggered, right? A lot of those things. And then finally, we decided a set of practices. When conflict flares up, what practices do we agree on? This is a protocol, right? What are the step-by-step things that we're going to do? And so we talked about coping skills and what not to do, like trying to resolve conflict while Nathan's ADHD medicine has already worn off and it's 8 p.m. at night and he just doesn't have a lot of resources to be patient. Maybe we'll use the conflict canvas and we'll write our thoughts before we share them, right? Apology is a good place to start. And I taught him something that we created called the conflict circle, right? And so we said, we're going to use the next step in the conflict circle to go through how to resolve this. So these were the agreements that we came to, and this hung on a bulletin board in the hallway right by our kitchen so that we could quickly reference it if we needed. So again, this is a template, but you also have it as a PDF that you downloaded. And to summarize, there's the 4 Ps. We started from the top: purpose, perspective, principles, and practices, right? And that's the process that we went through. And it might sound like it took a lot of time, but this is a long-term relationship. But this isn't something that we wrote just for one conflict. It's something that we wanted to persist. And it's a special kind of working agreement within a team. When we find that things are getting hot and hard, how do we want to be together? And so creating a working agreement called a conflict protocol, a special instance of a working agreement, is really important with these teams that are going to be long-standing and working on innovative, difficult things where there's lots of opinions and differences. How do we want to treat those differences? And how do we create it in a way that those are like our neurodiverse colleagues, neurodivergent colleagues, like my son, so that he knows how to participate in the process and not feel like he doesn't know how to engage or how does he has to withdraw because he's not sure about what's going on. But a protocol like this helps him feel confident, helps me feel confident in pursuing a solution. So this is the Canvas example that you have. And again, I encourage you to use it in your own relationships, in your own teams, where you find, like these colleagues of mine that kept coming back to that, ooh, we're almost in conflict, we're stepping away. They never resolved the decisions that we needed to resolve because it was too messy for them to get too close and the relationship was too important to them. And so they would stay away from it instead of working through it and then persisting that agreement in a way that they could honor it. I wish that we might have had this template at the time. Again, it's a template that has had some use, but as you share it and have improvement ideas, I'd love to hear about them. I wanted to give you an example of what it might look like in the workplace. So Samantha, my colleague who helped me create this, she and I created this conflict protocol. And we have a purpose when we work together to create tools and resources to help individuals. And our perspectives are here about how we want to work together and how we see conflict, how we approach conflict. Listen to learn and understand, have a kind heart and a curious mind, no judgment, see it as a growth opportunity. We have some principles that help us. For example, we don't work at the same place. She's busy, I'm busy, so we have to agree to some things like be responsive to one another, intentionally schedule. If something doesn't go quite right, assume positive intent, be generous, be aware that if something's not going to work, take care of yourself and ask for what you need. And then our practices are over here, right? Relationship over timelines, ask questions, ask for what you need, etc. So it's served in work and home environments, and I think that it would benefit you in both. Okay, I'm looking at our time, and I know that we want to start taking questions in about 15 minutes. And so I'm curious if we can try an exercise together at this point. I've prepared one. Does it feel like this is going to require you to try some of these things out? Let me go back. Are you guys ready for that? Are you up for a small group conversation? Okay. I saw enough nods that I think that there's hope for. Sometimes when you give everybody a small group conversation, half the audience bails out and they're like, I just didn't want to talk about this. But if you've hung with us long enough to get to this point, then let's make sure you do have a conversation about it and you put some practice to this. So I shared with you a little link which will take you to this Lucid Spark board. And this board is set up for us to have an activity. Now, there's a couple of things you might not have ever tried Lucid Spark before. This is one of the products that I work on. It's like you give an Agile coach a great development team, you go crazy and build a really great collaboration environment. So you're seeing everybody's cursors move around. That may not distract you, but if it does, then you can just come up here to this little caret by everybody's initials and come down here and turn off share cursors so that it doesn't distract you. If you're not certain how to use Lucid Spark, I gave you a little bit of a primer over here. You can look at things like how do you move things? How do you click on things? How do you make a post-it? That's pretty much all you're going to need to know is just how do I zoom in or out? How do I move my cursor? How can I move around? There's some specifics here. Post-its, just double click and then click on your post-it and you can type. All right, I'll show you. Double click, you'll get a post-it. It's already selected, so you can just type. All right, so that's all you're going to need to do for this exercise. But you can look at this section of the board if you have further questions. So what I'm going to have us do is in a minute, I'm going to focus on this canvas here. And I'm going to ask you to grab some of these post-its down below, make it easy for you. Just grab one, drag it up here. Since it's selected, I can type right into it, okay? And so the first thing I want you to do is I'm going to ask you to think about, I don't think we're going to need 5 minutes because we're a smaller group, but I'm going to ask you to think about when we're in the perspectives, what are a couple of items, and I'm going to ask you to share them. And then I'm going to teach you how to add an emoji or upvote people so we can see what ideas are really useful. So let me walk you through this. Let's say that we're a team and we call ourselves the Agile Austin Coaching Meetup team. We're a high-performing team and we're working on something truly innovative. And so we know we have diverse perspectives. We have individuals in our group who are neurodiverse, all of us are. And so we ought to respect each other. We want to have a healthy approach should conflict occur. And so we're going to create this protocol together. So I told you what perspectives are. I want you to go ahead and grab a Post-it and let's brainstorm together a bunch of ideas about what might be useful perspectives, the lens through which we see the world that you might contribute to this. So go ahead and jump in and think about how do we perceive conflict? Again, you can double click to get a Post-it, or if you're unsure how to do that, I gave you a whole bunch down here. You can just grab one, drag it up into the perspective section. All right, who will get us started?
All right, so do you want us to do it directly on the canvas, Bryan?
Yes, yeah, go ahead. Unless you're struggling, I can scribe for you if you struggle.
Did everybody find it? I think we're moving now.
And a perspective is how we think or feel about conflict. That's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the glasses that you look through when you think about conflict?
Got it.
All right, I see some coming in here. All perspectives are truths. Conflict is painful and uncomfortable. It's necessary but hard. I'm going to put mine over here by that because they're very similar. It's inevitable. It's a growth opportunity. It's scary. 100% conflict avoidance is not what we should be looking for. Great. Stressful and alienating. You guys know what your perspectives are, and you're not afraid to share them. That's really great. These perspectives would help others that you're working with understand how you see conflict and therefore how we might want to address it. Okay, let's come down here to the principles section and let's keep going. Principles are fundamental beliefs rooted in our values. They guide us and can inform our actions so we can be intentional. You guys start working on, I'm going to turn on the lights because in my area it's getting dark. Assume good intent. That's a great principle. What serves us when things get hard? What inspires us to be constructive? How do we show up as our best self? Listen to understand. Mutual respect. Take a deep breath. Empathy. I remember going through coach training with a colleague as we were working on conflict. She said, at home, my husband comes home from work and I'm like all casualed up for the night, and he's standing there in a suit and tie. He always wins when we have an argument because he's standing over me and I'm lounging and comfortable. She's like, we've decided that we don't get to have a discussion until we're on a level playing field. So he'll put on his pajamas or whatever and get casual and talk about it, but we're not going to have an argument when I'm looking at him in a suit and tie. It just doesn't, it's not fair, right? Actively listening. We're better together. That's a great principle. One person speaking at a time. So you'd see that you and the others that you'd be working on this with might contribute all kinds of ideas. And now we need to talk about like, okay, well, which ones do we like? So let me teach you. So I'm just going to right click on this card and I could do all kinds of things here, but the one I really want to do is right here available. I want to add a reaction. I want to say, ooh, that's 100%. And then you could click on my 100% and we'd see like 15 people who all think this is a really great one. So we could quickly upvote that item, for example, or just let other people know which ones you really like, which ones you agree with, which ones are pure fire, right? We're better together. That's like click. That's pure fire, right? All right, so have some fun with it and let everybody know which ones you like. But we're going to move over to practices. All right, so this is the concrete stuff that is informed by our purpose and informed by our perspectives. And then we're going to put it to work, combining our principles and say, all right, so what are the actions that we will take as we apply our principles in our best efforts to address conflict? Let's add some cards here. Take turns sharing. Take a 5 to 10 minute break. Collect yourself, come back more resourceful. Yeah. Keep your messages concise. My daughter, who's 25 years old now, we found that we had to do a communications protocol where she spoke. It actually comes from the core protocols. It's called listen. So she spoke, and then I would repeat back what she said and ask if I got it right. She would say yes or no, and then she would share the next little piece. It was like TCP/IP protocol, like an acknowledgement, and then she would continue until she was done. Then I would say, would you listen to me? It took that type of a protocol to get to the point where she felt heard and we weren't trying to talk on top of each other. Concise messages. Breathe. Avoid raising your voice. Don't interrupt. Use I statements. There we go. Somebody says 100%, I agree with that. Ask what and how. All right. I think you guys understand how this works. Look how our canvas is getting filled with ideas. Now, we want to be clear, like any kind of working agreement, just because the ideas were brainstormed here by the team doesn't mean it's actually a done protocol. There needs to be some discussions and alignment and maybe grouping and sorting. And then we have a decision to make. Can we try this? Let's start with an experiment. Let's try this and see if we can put it to use. And so, for example, when conflict flares up in our team, what are we going to do about it? We're not going to ignore it. As a coach, I was taught to name it. We name what's going on, right? And then we give the team some time to cool down. Maybe I'm just thinking through like what might be a lightweight protocol. Then we come back together. We have a facilitated discussion or whatever the team agrees on. Those might be the practices that we put into place. But they're all anchored in the perspectives that we hold and the principles that we want to grasp onto so that we can achieve the purpose that we have in being together. Again, I recommend this and ask you to help me make it better. Will you do that? That seems some nods. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to switch back from this to the board we were looking at before and share a couple more things before we end. So, I'm going to give you 6 tips that were part of an article that Sid and Lanny asked me to share. But let me share why I have these tips, right? I talked to you about my hope for the workplace, a place where my kids can succeed. My son just turned 16, so he got his first job and he lasted 4 days. And his sister got a job at the same place and she's still employed there. And when they fired him, he didn't know he was fired. And I dropped him off for the next day of work. And he called me 3 minutes later. I just barely made it down the road. And he called and said, "Dad, can you come back and get me?" And I could tell he was all choked up. And I went to get him and he got in the car and we were driving home. And he said, they said I was fired. And they said that they told me that yesterday. And so we talked about it. And then the manager is really nice, somebody that we know. And he spent some time talking to Jennifer, my wife, afterwards and said, here's the thing is there's like 32 people on the crew at this restaurant where he was working. And that is just maybe way too much for Nathan. He doesn't get anything done. Maybe he needs a job where he just has one thing to focus on, because Nathan kind of did have social relationships with a lot of people in the restaurant, but the tasks weren't getting done. And, you know, Cassidy, my daughter, who's also autistic and ADHD, she was able to focus and get things done, right? So I want a workplace that we understand how to support somebody like Nathan and Cassidy and can take advantage of all of the superpowers that they have, as they do. But it's not going to be a place where we can just trust that they don't need support, right? So is there going to be a place for my children in the future? I've been a parent advocate for them for 20 years now, trying to create awareness and understanding about what's going on in their worlds and create opportunities for them in their schools and social institutions. And now I know they're headed off to college. Some of my children are already in college. They're headed off to jobs. And I don't know that they're going to be welcome in the workplace. I don't know if they're going to be misunderstood or if they'll be marginalized. And so I think there's a lot of obstacles for us to eliminate. And we're part of the problem oftentimes because we're still learning about this as well. But each of us can do something about it. The work environment often is rigid and it favors universal approaches. And so the workplace is oftentimes the source of the problem as well. So as I work and write about this topic, I've been suggesting some very basic things that you're going to find are very common. Like you're going to recognize them. You're going to say, that sounds a lot like agility. But I think that there's some basic core practices within agility that really work well for neurodivergent individuals like my children, like the team members that I work with. And I want to share these 6 tips. There's probably more of them, but so far when I write about this, that's about all that they want me to say, right? 6 is enough. Like you give us an article with more than that, it's going to be too much. The first one is, and I'm using business language here rather than language that we see in our agile practices, but I tell leaders that they need to create patterns for neurodivergent individuals. A sprint is a great pattern for an individual. You know, I work with a marketing team. We have a 1-week sprint. They understand that it has a start and an end, and that work gets done in the middle, and then there's a breather, right? And that there's going to be some events along the way. It's a repeatable pattern. It works really nicely for all of the individuals in the group. So first I tell leaders to create patterns for teams. And then I suggest that we ought to define what success looks like. Every developer I've worked with, if they don't understand what the finish line looks like, they get extremely anxious. I'm going to gold plate the thing until I think it's done. What does done look like? You know, this is definition of done. So for any work item, help my child understand what done looks like. In the restaurant, while I'm struggling to get that task done, I don't know what done looks like. What's good enough, right? And so clarify that finish line. Create transparency. You're familiar with that one. Make the work visible and empower the team to make decisions about how much work we could get done in every patterned increment, right? Iteration. And then we'll work to achieve it, right? Involve us in the decision-making, because then it's very clear that we've communicated about what we're trying to get done in that time period. Meet daily. I think my kids and my colleagues all benefit from that type of communication, where we meet every day. And also we love to meet at the same place at the same time, or on the same Zoom call, so that we can not have one more thing to worry about, right? So that we know what to expect. And our anxiety goes down as we meet together to talk about these things. Then teach them about the importance of inspecting and adapting, right? Continuous improvement, and how we identify room for improvement and make plans. That's part of our pattern, right? Reuse that pattern. And then finally, tip number 6, help us understand the importance of building bonds within teams. Not just getting the work done, but helping to build the relationships that allow the work to be a joy, and the relationships that you can rely on when you need help, when you have questions, when you struggle. Allow that development to happen, because there's something between the people rather than just the work. Okay. So these are tips that I think help us to talk about how to help these individuals have a place to succeed, where this is at least a great set of practices to experiment with and get started. So that's what I prepared to talk about. We're going to do Q&A and talk about the questions you've been talking about secretly in the chat while I couldn't follow along. And I'll answer any of those questions. And I wanted you to have access to these articles that you could use. It's actually been really interesting to write on this topic, because these first 3 articles, I wrote something too long and they said break it down into 3 parts. So it was published in 3 different parts. And then I started getting requests to write it in different forms. So it's now, some of this has been published in Dutch and in German and in the UK. And I think it's an interesting time to talk about this. And I think we're going to see some shifts, because we're trying to be more inclusive and aware of the diversity that exists out there, and neurodiversity being one of them. So I tried to make it easy so that you could grab the QR codes. If you're interested in this topic, the articles might be interesting. The podcast is one more place you can hear me talk about this. And if you don't have the links to the materials, we definitely will share them with you. All right, I'll drop my screen. Well, I'll leave it here for a while in case you're grabbing these, and hand it back to Lonnie and Sid in case there's a way that you want to tackle questions.
Well, let me just open it up first. Is there anybody who has a question or a comment based on what you've heard so far? And if you don't feel comfortable coming off, you can post that in chat, and we'll read it out for you. But it's also open mic.
I don't know if anyone else follows Bryan on LinkedIn, but I always appreciate whenever he posts an article up to the site. He writes clearly and distinctively, but with a really human perspective. And so I would just like to give a shout out to Bryan's writing.
Thank you, Erin.
I know I'm definitely interested in following up with that. There was a question earlier when we were talking about, and I don't know, I think Kim, you brought this up, and I don't know if anybody knows, but the question was around waiting and not and doing it in a resolving it in a timely manner. And I believe the question was, does this also does that same thing about it getting into your brain, the
Around
pattern?
short-term and long-term memory.
Thank you, Erin. Does it also apply to when we have, conflicts with ourselves, not just conflicts with others? Is it important to resolve those immediately? I think that was one of the questions.
Yes, thanks, Sid. I asked about if it applies to internal conflict as well, the need to resolve the conflict quickly, or if that pushes that internal conflict. I was thinking about self-criticism. I know it's not unique to neurodivergent individuals, but people who struggle with negative self-talk. And if part of the reason why it's so hard to deal with is in part related to that tendency for unresolved conflict to get stored into long-term memory.
Did you want to take that one, Bryan, or?
Oh, sorry, Kim. I thought she was asking you, and we're anxious.
Oh,
to hear what
cool.
your
I
thought
didn't
was.
want to, I didn't want to step on your toes.
Oh, no.
I mean, from my understanding for neuroscience is, yeah, when things get into long-term memory, it is harder to resolve. It's not that it's impossible. And, that's why there's things that happened when we were children and we're still kind of reacting to it today, kind of thing, or that negative self-talk. And it makes me also think of forgetting both of their names. It's Keegan and for the immunity to change stuff.
Yeah, Keegan and Leahy.
Thank you. Thanks, Bryan. Right, is getting clear on the why of the situation. Right, why am I negative self-talking? And can I get to the root of that? You might need to do like the 5 whys kind of scenario to get to really the root of why I'm doing that. It's harder to do it with yourself, that's for sure.
I was thinking it'd be interesting to do one of the protocol canvas for yourself. You're like, when something comes up, you're like, what do I do when I'm feeling that?
Yeah.
And that might be helpful too, because it's not like you're always, the other person may not be ready to resolve that conflict, and you may need to do what you can on your side if they're not in that space to do it.
No, Leora, I'm not an expert in this, just my wife is. So I hear her teaching my kids about automatic negative thoughts. Ants is what they're called, right? And how they occur and what to do about them and how to work to eliminate them. And, I see that in the world today as our teens deal with social media and comparison and perfectionism and all of these things that flare up, and it really affects your self-image and how you value yourself. And that can lead to, I talked to a group yesterday about suicide. Yesterday was the World Suicide Awareness Day, and can lead to things like suicidal ideation and things like that. So I think trauma exists the longer we sit with an unresolved conflict, and well, it's not necessarily resolved, but if we don't care for it, like working through therapy or things like that, then I think it can make a dent in our heart for sure. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that all. Yeah, I will definitely say, Leora, thanks so much for all your comments in the chat. I loved your perspective on some of these, and I know this may also come up, Bryan, because I think Leora brought up a couple of things around, especially when we think of remote. So you were talking about looking people in the eye, with your son. There's also like being on video. Or Leora is talking about like having a daily stand-up to some might be disruptive. So I don't know if you've faced some of those where there's some variations to how we work, in this remote setting.
Yeah, I think it's a good place. And this is my old, I mean, I've been a CST for 17 years. So I would always start with, let's try the training rules out and then adapt them based on what the team needs. Once the team is confident enough that they understand the practice, they can start to say, this practice works for us sometimes and in these ways, and other times it doesn't. And let's try those experiments out and then decide. I'm very pragmatic about that. And so I have teams that are non-software teams that don't do a daily stand-up, but they do sync every day. And today's tools are really powerful for that. The ability to mention somebody here on your board, for example, and have tasks created, and it can be a really effective way to work. So I think we're still scratching the surface of how powerful async work can be. And I think Agile is going to tweak itself a bit based on what we're learning.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Bryan. Want to say just thanks to everybody too for participating. I think we've talked about every little bit. We do.
Lonnie, could I share one more thing?
Oh, yeah.
So I was just reacting a bit to the board with a conflict resolution protocol. This has been really important to me as a neurodivergent individual trying to navigate the corporate world, and actually just life generally, is something if you're really invested and curious in learning more about neurodiversity and how to support neurodivergent individuals, is I'd recommend looking at what's called the double empathy problem. And like I saw a mention of some things like managing your body language. And I'd strongly encourage some people to consider that body language isn't universal, the same way that emotions on people's faces are not universal. We're very steeped in our own cultural bubbles, and there's been psychological studies across different cultures to prove this. And many neurodivergent people end up on the short end of the stick in terms of the assumptions people draw off of what they're seeing and what they're assuming, because they don't understand that the neurodivergent individuals may be expressing themselves in a way that they're not used to seeing, so they're misinterpreting. And so I would just caution anyone, if you're writing your protocols, like writing something like that. And I'd encourage, one thing to do is normalize having conversations about how you communicate, how you process information, so that you learn to work together effectively. And I think normalizing those sorts of conversations in your team is really, really important to effectively support neurodivergent people. So
great information, Laura.
Yeah, another great resource. I do want to end on time, but I know Kim, you have a hand raised. Do you have, like, you squeeze in a minute?
Yep. I just wanted to just reiterate what Bryan said about, he mentioned pretty briefly nonviolent communication with Marshall Rosenberg. It's now called compassionate communication. Super helpful. A big takeaway from Marshall's work is people can't hear you until they feel heard. And that also plays into, Bryan, you were mentioning how you approached with your daughter. That's similar to Gay and Katie Hendricks' imago theory. If anyone wants to read on that, that's actually a very prescriptive way for one-on-one relationships, how to communicate. And you need to understand not only what your other person is concerned about, but also their feelings, and you keep playing it back till you have it and they said, yes, you're understanding me correctly, before you say anything. And that can be super helpful. Maybe not needing that to the extreme in corporate America, but just, Bryan just mentioned these gems really, really briefly, and I just wanted to punctuate them. So
it sounds like that. Yeah, we covered a lot in this session: communication, neurodiversity, conflict. So it sounds like we could have whole sessions on all of those topics. Thanks, Kim, for those additional, and Leora for those additional resources. So we do want to end on time. Just a quick reminder, do join us in October. So want to speak to our presenters that are joining us in October. I had the pleasure of going through the organizational and relationship systems coaching with both Chi and Fran. So super amazing coaches. They also co-founded an organization called Agile Disciples, which helps to increase the more agile coaching capabilities. And trust is very huge, no matter what you do in an organization. So do hope you join us all in October. And as always, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. This can't be as successful if we don't have people coming in here and participating. So with that, have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Sid and Lonnie.
Bonnie.
Thank you, Brian.